Hello, this is Julian with Coffea Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Keramo wash processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And they're one of our most featured European coffee roasters on this channel, and a coffee roaster that will appear quite a bit over the next few months as we review their Gala Morales line of Ecuadorian coffees. While purchasing those coffees, this one caught my attention, largely due to how popular the Keramo coffees were last year. And as I've said in the past, Coffea Circulor typically offers some of the best representation of popular coffees. So we'll see if this one lived up to that expectation, as this right here is day 38. The recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, Coffea Circulor is notorious for roasting on the lighter side of things, very much in line with the term Nordic Light, as this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and immediately on the first try there was some wild intensity in terms of a ripe fresh fruit with a lingering citric finish. A more sugary stone fruit as well, though it felt a little bit in a peachy sense with plenty of the listed tart apple brightness. So for the most part, a very pretty first impression and very much in line with a lot of the expectations I had for it going into it. Day 17 through the Chemex, and it was once again instantly more fresh fruit forward, as it offered plenty of the listed melon-like attributes with a complementary sweeter stone fruit present yet again, also with a bit of an added level of clarity as it was a little bit cleaner through this brew method, as somewhat expected. There's still a surprising level of brightness as it continues to impact the finish with a bit more acidity than initially expected going into this one. A pretty well layered cup of coffee. But we continue on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer. And once again, it's instantly offering more of those fresh fruit aspects with a fair bit of peachiness to complement what is a very crisp and well-defined melon-like attribute on this day. A lingering citric brightness followed by a toffee-like sweetness and finish. The cup continues to be well layered with great depth and wonderful fruit-forward components throughout. Another excellent day of this coffee. I was really impressed by the first 3 days of this coffee that we had. We continue on to day 22. Opted for the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and interestingly enough, it has mixed results. So for anybody that's not familiar, our primary brew method and recipe is actually based off of Coffea Circulor's V60 recipe. We just swapped their 15:1 to a 16:1, and we went a little higher on the temperatures, but for the most part, everything else remains the same, including the water that we use. So oftentimes when I do adjust the recipe, if the coffee is already good, I do see a nice little bump and increase in the overall results. This one didn't necessarily yield that, as there wasn't quite as much of the ripe fruit forward components to it, and it was opting for a little greater definition to the apple-like attributes in this one, which isn't necessarily what I was going for in this one. I was looking for more of those fresh fruit components to it, but there was a bit of the classic bergamot-like attribute to it, with these stone fruits also having a little bit of notoriety. It was a nice day. It was just different, especially given the experiences I'd had from the first couple of tries on this one. Day 25 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's a surprisingly notable amount of brightness once again, as there's some really notable definition to the green apple. And I do have to say that in the past I haven't necessarily experienced a very well-defined green apple-like attribute. This one did buck that trend, as it seemed to be pretty well articulated, even if it's not necessarily something that I'm going for in this one. I felt like there was a preference towards the V60, as this one came out a little bit more tart than I was liking or expecting. So we continue on to day 28, another try through the Chemex, and it has seemed to skew a lot more in the tarts direction naturally over time. And that's when I began to wonder, is this just the direction that this coffee is going, or is this the way that this coffee is actually intended to be? Fresh fruit aspects are still present, and the secondary component to it is a well-defined green apple, and then it continues to also offer plenty of the honey and toffee-like components to it with some great layering and depth. The Chemex seems to be pretty nice, but for the most part I think that the V60 was just a little better because of some of the other fruit components it presented. Day 31, another try through the Chemex. And I was trying to decide which brew method I was preferring at this time. It was a little tricky given that the best experiences I had had were with the V60, but I was really enjoying the clarity that the Chemex was offering. And once again, that's the same thing as the fresh fruit aspects are there to complement the tart apple brightness. But that was the biggest issue I'd had with this brew method, was it really seemed to accentuate those qualities. Still a nice bit of brown candy with a slight florality. Pretty nice day. Day 34, final notes we have, and we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it did replicate some of the best experiences we'd had from the earlier days, as there was a heightened focus on the fresh fruit aspects with plenty of the stone fruit and fresh melon complemented by the citric brightness. Overall, a pretty great experience on this final day. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. So let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, and I think one big thing I do have to say about that is through the V60 was on the slightly higher side of the level 4, though once again it was skewing in a very clean direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying as much as I did with the V60. Even then, it is on the cleaner side of that level 4. We are working with a washed Ethiopian coffee, which tend to be some of the cleanest coffees out there. So level 4 feels like a very good placement for this one. Once again, higher side of the level 4. Finish, level 4. So even with all of the aforementioned brightness, there is kind of more of an even finish to this one, though I would have to say that it's also on the slightly higher side of the level 4, and that's going to be a theme that you're going to see in this tasting wheel. A lot of these numbers are on the slightly higher side of them. Finish, while it did skew a little bit more in that tart as well as citric direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying, I think the initial stages of this coffee made up for it. So the finish isn't necessarily my best part of this coffee, but there's a fair bit of it throughout. Sweetness, level 4. This one I don't think is necessarily surprising. I think what's really surprising about it is that it was skewing a lot in that brown candy direction. So I do have a toffee note listed on here. It's been kind of interesting for me, as we've had a lot more washed Ethiopian coffees have a little bit more of a brown candy experience to them. And this one right here seems to have that in notable abundance, which is something we're going to discuss a little more. In addition to that, though, there's plenty of fruit brightness, so I can see that also scoring that level 4 for that mark. However, I do have to say it's maybe on the higher side of level 4 because of the candy-like attribute to it. Acidity, level 4. That was one of the first notes I had when discussing this coffee, is that it turned out to be a little bit brighter than I might have expected. And if I recall correctly, that's been some of the experiences I've had with these Keramo coffees in general. So that's in line with that experience, though at the end, I wasn't necessarily expecting it to maybe score that high, given I don't necessarily always get the really high scoring brightness from Coffea Circulor's coffees. This one's a bit of an exception. Florality, level 4. I haven't really discussed that too much throughout this review, but I do have to say that there's that honey-like florality that I'm experiencing a fair bit throughout, though I would say that it's maybe not necessarily as pronounced or as prominent, at least in most of the days, as some of the other fruit components to it. But at the end of the day, I said it's definitely notable enough to at least reach that level 4 mark, at least on this day as well. Grapefruit, level 4. And that's going to be those melon-like attributes to it, which is something I experienced very early on in this one, and on certain days one of the most pronounced characteristics to it. That's going to be a little bit of a theme you're going to see with the fruit components here. Is certain days you're experiencing a fair bit of maybe the more melon-like attributes, other days you're experiencing a little bit more of the peachiness, and if I recall correctly, I don't think that they have a peach note listed on here, but some other stone fruit. And then on other days, as we're going to discuss right here, the citrus fruit scored that level 4 because the bergamot-like attributes also seem to skew in that direction. But in addition to that, there's a little bit more generic citrus as well. Specifically for me, I would say it had the slight spice-like bergamot quality that's present from a lot of Coffea Circulor's coffees. Stone fruit, as I already mentioned, level 4. For me, it was a little bit of a peachy attribute at times, and when I was able to get that, of course, as you'd imagine, that was my favorite part of this coffee. So all 3 of those fruit components score at that level 4. It's just a trade-off of which day was maybe a little bit more pronounced, and that was contingent upon which brew method you opted for, or at least the recipe on it. Caramel, level 4. As I mentioned, that's toffee-like sweetness to this one, which took me back at first, but the more I drank this coffee, the more I really began to appreciate it, as it reminded me, interestingly enough, a little bit of those Mejorado coffees, which in itself was very nice. So given that this one was scoring fairly high in the sweetness while still offering plenty of those fruit components, but the sweetness was in a candied sense, as you'd imagine, I very much enjoyed that. Last thing worth discussing is the body at the level 2. And that one may have been a little interesting to me, but I mean, we're working with a washed Ethiopian coffee, and it's not going to have the most body to begin with. And at times when brewing it with the V60, I could say that it's closer to that level 3, Obviously with the Chemex, it's a little bit more light-bodied, but I don't think I have too much to add to that. As I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one has actually been my favorite wash processed Keramo coffee, and I do have to put that huge caveat on there because the natural processed Keramo from Father's last year is my favorite Keramo coffee that I've ever had. And that's kind of interesting to me because I really wanted to try Coffea Circulor's natural Keramo. I believe they had it early last year. I just didn't have enough other coffees I was interested in to purchase that one specifically. And I'm very curious to see how those two coffees would have stacked up side by side. As far as the wash processed Keramo coffees have gone though, I think this one's by far my favorite. And I think the big reason for that is that it did offer tremendous definition and sweetness. Those two things did score on the higher side of the level 4 for me. But the fruit depth that was present in this one, especially when I was able to get the peachy aspect, it was really nice. Now, I've said before, I can take or give a lot of the citric components in coffees. But given that the other fruit components were scoring pretty high in this, the berry fruits in terms of that melon component, as well as plenty of stone fruits, of course I was going to enjoy those parts. And in addition to that, the sweetness that was coming from the candied side of things in terms of that toffee sense, well, I just found great depth to this one. And it's not something that I've necessarily experienced from the other Keramo coffees. They've tended to skew in one specific direction or another, while maybe having a couple of components here and there, focus on the florality, focus on the brightness, focus on the citrus. This one right here just seemed to offer so many different things, and that made it a little bit more enjoyable of a drink for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like it's worth a shot if you really enjoyed a lot of the Keramo coffees in the past, especially if they did offer plenty of those bright components that you enjoyed. This one's still going to have those while still offering some additional fruit factors, all while maintaining some very high clarity and some very enjoyable sweetness. So combine those things with the added toffee-like component, that candied aspect to it, and you're getting a very sweet, clean, fruit-forward, and floral cup of coffee, which is everything I look for, especially when it comes to a wash-processed Ethiopian coffee, because this one was by no means mooring, which tends to be the case with a lot of Ethiopian coffees. I think for the most part, I'll leave this one at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Keramo Wash Processed Ethiopia from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.